Hello, I'm Stuart McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association, and I'd like to welcome you to this special episode of the White House 1600 Sessions. Today, we're in a little bit different format. We have a town hall here at historic Decatur House, where we're going to have a conversation with presidential historian and noted biographer Richard Norton Smith, who has written biographies of President Washington, President Hoover, and Vice President Rockefeller. He spent years in research for this book, and I can't wait to dive into conversation with him and learn more about the life, the history, the presidency, and the legacy of our 38th president, Gerald R. Ford. So, Richard, it's an honor to have you with us here today at the White House Historical Association.
Thank you. One important thing that has to be said at the outset, which sets Gerald Ford apart from most presidents, and indeed I suspect most politicians, he liked reporters. He liked reporters. When we were planning his funeral, two things that he really wanted. He wanted Jimmy Carter to be one of the eulogists, which would make an important point. You know, these two men who had really worked up a mutual antagonism by Election Day 1976, and who subsequently became the best of friends. But equally important, he wanted a journalist. And originally, of course, it was going to be the late, great Hugh Sidey, who is obviously inseparable from this organization.
That's right.
And Gerald Ford outlived two knee operations, and sadly, he outlived a lot of his friends. So Tom Brokaw stepped in, who, of course, as a very young correspondent, cut his teeth on the Ford White House. And also was by the only way at Vail, when every reporter wanted to get a picture of Ford falling down, Brokaw was the exception. He went skiing with the president.
Wow.
And Ford said privately to a friend that most reporters get their exercise sitting on bar stools. But Tom Brokaw was an exception.
Well, this is the book, An Ordinary Man, The Surprising Life and Historic Presidency of Gerald R. Ford. Why did you undertake a book on Gerald Ford? How long did it take? And what did you learn from this experience?
Well, I guess there have been other books. I was fortunate in knowing him. And more than that, gaining access to a great deal of material that had not been available to earlier biographers. So this is actually the first, in effect, cradle to grave biography that's been written since his passing in 2006. It's interesting, because I knew him, because we were reasonably close, I worried not about my capacity to be objective, but whether readers would accept me as being objective. I remember just across the street at David McCullough's beloved Hay Adams, we had a lunch, and I told him this. He said, "Write what you know." And of course, the irony is that was a license to spend 10 years discovering all the things I didn't know about Gerald Ford. And ultimately, the justification for this book, I suppose, is what we didn't know in terms of facts. There are a lot of some surprising factual revelations, but more important, ultimately, is the historical perspective.
When and how did you first meet Gerald Ford?
I was at Harvard, and it was March of 1974. He was vice president. And he came in. I said later on that it was a learning experience for both sides, because the Harvard Republican Club gave him an award. We were surprised that Richard Nixon would allow his vice president to venture into enemy territory, which, needless to say, Harvard was. And no doubt he was surprised that there were enough Republicans at Harvard to form a club. But in any event, he subsequently came. I remember, I'm sure I was not the first person that spring to commit the error of introducing him as the next president of the United States. I don't think it's an introduction he particularly liked hearing. He was walking a tightrope. He said later on, the vice presidency was the worst job he ever had. And it's a difficult job under the best of circumstances. And he had it under the worst of circumstances. He basically had to pretend to himself, convincingly to the public, that there was no possibility that he would ever become president, while at the same time, in the back of his mind, wondering, what if? And this was a progression. He took office believing Richard Nixon's description of Watergate. 2 days after the break-in, he confronted John Mitchell and said, do you know anything about this? Does the president know anything about this? And Mitchell obviously denied both. One of the revelations in the book, before Ford leaves office, just a few days before he leaves, Bill Simon, his Secretary of the Treasury, approaches him about a pardon for John Mitchell. He didn't get very far. And I think it wasn't because of the aftermath of the Nixon pardon. It's because, as he said, that damn guy lied to my face. Gerald Ford was someone who all his life never changed, was taught by his mother to look for the good in people. Some people thought he was naive. He later on said that some of my political friends feel that I've carried forgiveness to an extreme, obviously referring to the pardon. But the other side of that coin was he expected people to be as honest with him as he was with them.
Well, we'll talk quite a bit about the vice presidency and the presidency, but I want to go back to the beginning and what crafted and made and formed the man who became those things. And born in Nebraska, grew up in Grand Rapids, but was it not born Gerald Ford?
No. I mean, talk about a broken family. It's a much more broken family than people know. He was born Leslie King in Omaha in July 1913. And I was the first person to see, outside the family, to see his baby book. And there's a particularly poignant page, Baby's First Automobile Ride. It was taken when he was 2 weeks old. 2 days after his birth father walked into the bedroom clutching a butcher knife, threatening to kill mother and child. And his mother, a remarkable woman, Dorothy King, later Dorothy Ford, basically 2 days later slipped out of the house with her infant, crossed the Mississippi to Iowa, got a train to Chicago where she had relatives, eventually moved to Grand Rapids. But the interesting thing is, Ford was addressed as Junie, the diminutive of Junior, until he was 15 years old. He didn't know whether he was Junior King, his birth name, or Junior Ford. He stuttered. I mean, there are just so many sort of way stations where you figure that this guy's doomed.
Well, being a successful single mom in the 19 teens was an unusual thing. How did that context and seeing his mother struggle but yet raise a child impact his later political philosophy?
Not long before he died, a relative of his was asking his secret of political success. And Ford said, I made everyone else's problems my problems. Interesting. What really though stands out is I dug deeper and found that he used the exact formula to describe his mother. So clearly that was a pattern that was set, very early on, and almost foreshadowed his congressional career. In a lot of ways, he had to unlearn congressional leadership in order to become an executive. I mean, that's part of the backstory of the Ford presidency.
He was a Boy Scout, and those words
The only
really
Eagle
describe.
Scout.
That's right.
The only Eagle
president
Scout to be
an Eagle Scout,
president.
yeah.
And he never stopped being an Eagle Scout.
Yes.
I mean, that's the funny thing. Classic example. First press conference as president, end of August. He really believes that the press is going to want to ask about inflation and, the NATO alliance, which is coming apart at the seams, and all the questions that he's dealing with day by day. And of course, really all they want to talk about was Richard Nixon. That's when the pardon germinated. It had been on his mind, but that was the catharsis. He decided, is it going to be like this for the next 2 years?
Well, in addition to being a scout and an Eagle Scout, there's another part of his growing up that I want to ask you about and how it may have framed him, and that's attaining the opportunity to go to the great University of Michigan. And how did he get there? But he was a center for a championship team.
No.
And how did athletics frame him? And how did he even get in and afford the university?
Yeah, he's incredibly competitive all his life. He really took care of himself all his life. Football was his ticket to a university education. And then later on, Yale. People don't realize Gerald Ford spent more time at Yale than he did at the University of Michigan. He was both an assistant football coach.
And boxing, too.
Boxing, which he taught himself, lied that he knew how to box. and but also carried a full load of courses at the law school because he had decided he really wanted to be a lawyer, which I think meant he really wanted to go into politics. Athletics was the framework. The great story, of course, at the University of Michigan, we learned most was out of the classroom, and it was his great friend Willis Ward, who was an African American. He roomed with him on the road, on the team, and the story, classic story, Ford in his senior year was basically the best player on a team that won one game. But the one game he won was one for the history books. It was against Georgia Tech, which said they would not play if Michigan fielded an African American player. And Ford was torn. He almost quit the team. And Willis Ward convinced him to go out and play. They won the game. Michigan won the game 9-2. It was that kind of game. But the most memorable play was right after start of the second half. A trash-talking Georgia Tech player used the N-word. And on the next play, Ford and a linebacker knocked him out of the game. They carried him off in a stretcher. And Ford later told Willis Ward, that one was for you. Anyway, he and Willis Ward remained very good friends for the rest of Ward's life. The sequel is what makes the story. After Ford died, there was an effort in the Michigan legislature to replace one of the state statues in Statuary Hall. Replace the long-forgotten Zachariah Chandler with the state's only president. And there was opposition to this, mostly from conservative Republican members of the Senate, who some of them hadn't gotten over the Reagan fight, but many more took issue with Ford's pro-choice views and his outspoken support of affirmative action at the University of Michigan. But they wouldn't oppose it publicly. They were counting on inertia. The last day of the session, this thing looks like it may die. The Democratic minority leader, a senator from Detroit, African-American gentleman named Buzz Thomas, gets up and says, let me tell you something you may not know about Gerald Ford. And he proceeds to narrate this amazing story. And then he says, and by the way, I'm Willis Ward's grandson.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the statue went through. It's in the rotunda now, not far from the bust of Dr. King. 4 million people a year walk through that space. And at their best, as I write, they're reminded that America, at its best, is a work in progress.
Wow. So after law school at Yale, he returns to Grand Rapids and joins a friend in opening a law firm, and then World War II, and rises to the rank of lieutenant commander.
Yeah.
And how does the military service then frame his work on top of the scouts and the athleticism?
Yeah, I mean, he had a very impressive military career, about which he never talked, typically, I guess, for a lot of men of that generation. There was a great typhoon in December 1944, and the ship was on fire on top of everything else. So he smells smoke. He runs up to the deck. The ship lurches in these 100-mile-an-hour winds, and he rides the length of the ship on his back, and would have gone over, except every ship has a 2-inch railing. It's called a tow rail. It's actually there to keep tools from going overboard. In this case, it kept a future president from going overboard. He came back a changed man. He'd been an isolationist before the war, like Arthur Vandenberg, his hometown hero and mentor. He came back a militant internationalist. And I think for the rest of his life, he believed, he didn't think you had to have had military service in order to be president, but he thought it was an enormous asset.
He then returns to Grand Rapids in the law firm, and he eventually runs for Congress. And just before the election, he marries Elizabeth Bloomer. And he said something to the effect that she would have more of an impact on American society than he would.
Yeah.
How did he know that? What was his gut instinct?
Well, he said that toward the end of his life. He was very frank. He thought that when the history books were written, Mrs. Ford's contribution would be found to be greater than his own. But the politician, again, good old Jerry, there's another side to him. In 1948, He's an international. He wants to, against all odds, take on an entrenched Republican congressman, kind of a moss-back isolationist, who thought the world ended around the Indiana state line. So Ford ran for the best of reasons. I mean, he was a very ambitious young guy, but he ran because of an idea. However, he was also calculating, and he knew that district. West Michigan was then, much more than now, dominated by the Christian Reformed Church. It's a very culturally conservative area, and certainly divorce was frowned upon, not only by the Christian Reformed Church, but by Catholics as well. So he tells Mrs. Ford in February of 1948 that he wants to marry her, but he can't tell her when, and he can't tell her why he can't tell her. Well, the fact of the matter is, he wants to take this guy by surprise. And he's not even going to tell his fiancée. And in the end, of course, though, she turned out to be a huge asset. She recruited a lot of women who worked in the campaign. He had no money, so he basically, was shoe leather. And he was a very personable guy. And Harry Truman did him a great favor by calling a special session of Congress, which kept the congressman in Washington. Anyway, on primary day, Ford got endorsement from the UAW, which doesn't happen frequently in Michigan. He ran as a liberal, internationalist. That's the kind of congressman he was, until, ironically, he began to climb the ladder within the party. And then, of course, he became increasingly limited. But he had a strong pro-civil rights record, supported Harry Truman on a number of things.
You mentioned faith and the congressional district, and yet he never spoke much about his faith, but his mother and stepfather were devout people. Jimmy Carter, of course, spoke prolifically about his faith. What role, impact did faith play in Gerald Ford's life?
It was enormous, but he was also of that. His sister-in-law said, Jerry is not demonstrative. And she attributed that to his childhood and to both of his parents, But beyond that, he is of that generation and perhaps that faith tradition. In 1976, it turned out that he taught Sunday school as a young man when he came back from the war. And he refused to let the campaign people even talk about it. At a time when Jimmy Carter obviously was rallying, a huge army of believers, Ford, there was a privacy about the man. There's a wonderful scene on Election Day, 76, again, revolving a great reporter. At the airport, before they flew back to Washington, they unveiled a large mural of him and his parents and his life in Grand Rapids. And it moved him so, basically to tears, as he sort of recalled his parents and how much he wished that they were there, and so on and so on. But the wonderful sequence, Ron Nessen says to someone, told me, he goes over, a big smile on his face, he said, "Mr. President, you did the impossible. You made Helen Thomas cry."
Well, I always think of Gerald Ford as a man of the House of Representatives, and later we see him in a presidential context, but I didn't realize the effort he made to get on the ticket with Richard Nixon in 1960.
Again, it goes to this ambition. In 1960, he did something you're not supposed to do, especially in 1960. I mean, he actively campaigned to be Nixon's running mate, which also suggests how close a friendship they had. And afterwards, Henry Cabot Lodge was on the ticket, and there's a consensus that Lodge was not a very compelling candidate, frankly, a pretty lazy candidate. And Ford would say in later years, he said, "Whatever you think of my qualifications, I would have made a hell of a better candidate than Lodge." But his great ambition, of course, was to be Speaker of the House. And in 72, the year when Nixon swept 49 states, Ford was on the road 200 nights a year. I mean, the toll that took on his family, and particularly Mrs. Ford, was something that I think he had to live with, and he tried to make it up in later years. But in fact, he thought in 1972, this is finally what nobody knows, and I discovered from someone who fashioned the deal. going into to election night, 72, there was an understanding, 17 Southern Democrats, conservatives, obviously Nixon supporters, indicated that if Ford got close to the magic number of 218, they would switch parties. So Ford needed 31 seats. Actually, he didn't need 31 seats, but it turned out he only picked up 5. And so he made a deal with Mrs. Ford. He understood he was never going to be Speaker. He would run for one more term, and then he would leave office beginning of 77. He was 63, young enough to have a second career as a lawyer lobbyist. Then 6 weeks after the 72 election, unknown to him, this man who is eventually targeted as part of the Agnew probe informs a lawyer at a party who tells me the whole story almost 50 years later, and then eventually so anyway, Ford knows by February of 73, hey, I may not be Speaker, but guess what? There may be a vacancy of the vice presidency.
And of course, Agnew's tax evasion issues is out. How does Ford come in?
This has never been done before. And Nixon at that point was so politically weakened by Watergate that his options were really limited. As I said, he would have liked John Connally. He was mesmerized by John Connally. John Connally had all the kind of brassy, self-assurance that Nixon wished he had. And but the plain fact was that Connally couldn't be confirmed. He had switched parties recently from Democrat to Republican, and Senator Byrd from West Virginia told the White House, if you nominate Connally, there will be blood on the floor. Mel Laird, the great schemer, behind the scenes is working to get Ford into that place, and basically tells Nixon, you can't get Connally. Nixon privately referred to Ford about this time in an ambiguous reference. I still can't figure out whether he meant it as a compliment or an insult, but he referred to him in a private conversation as an honest Truman. Now, today, I think most of us would take that as a compliment. It's no accident that when Ford became president, and the first decision a president has to make is, how are you going to define yourself by the presidents whose portraits you hang in the cabinet room? Nixon had Eisenhower, TR, and Wilson, the great progressive duo, and Ford removed TR and Wilson and put in Abraham Lincoln and Harry Truman, the latter of which surprised a lot of people. But there are some real parallels.
So Ford becomes vice president. Do you think he had any concept or thinking where that was going to go, and that 8 months later, what
it's
would happen?
hard. It's astonishing. I've talked to Susan, I've talked to other members of the family. In the summer of 1974, the Ford family may have been the only family in America that was not having dinner table conversations about a possible change. When Ford took the job, he believed Nixon, and he certainly did not. He saw this as a very nice retirement, springboard. And I can't tell you exactly when he flipped. It was an evolutionary process. Over time, I think he concluded that he was not being told the truth. He certainly was not being told the whole story, which only deepened, in many ways, the quandary that he was in. He valued his reputation for honesty, not least of all with reporters. And yet he was in this position where, frankly, he couldn't be as honest as he might like to be with a lot of folks, including, by the way, members of his own family. Where exactly he decided, I don't know. Mrs. Ford did say, though, August 1st, a week before he became president, Al Haig came over and basically told him that, barring a miracle, he would be president in a matter of days. And Haig had the incredibly difficult, awkward, delicate task of trying to ease Nixon out of the presidency with maximum dignity, with minimum additional public divisiveness.
Well, in those last days and weeks leading up to the resignation, what was the direct conversation or relationship communication between Ford and Nixon himself?
Very, very limited. as you might imagine. Ford was passing word through Haig, if I can be helpful or if he wants someone to talk to, well, that, was not going to happen. The ultimate encounter took place really just the day before. Nixon spoke to the country on Thursday night and Ford was sworn in on Friday. So it was a very compressed, but there was an element for a week or so of would he or wouldn't he. There was no expectation strategically that the Nixon presidency could last much longer.
Well, that day that Nixon addresses the staff in the East Room of the White House and then is escorted out to the helicopter with the Fords, and there's that poignant moment of saying goodbye. There are 4 words in the book that strike me really more than anything. They're leaving the helicopter, walking back toward this White House, which is going to become their home, and he puts his arm around her and he says, "We can do it."
Mrs. Ford said that was the saddest day of her life. She dreaded the prospect. Plus, the Nixons were old friends. She and Pat Nixon had been friends for 25 years. And so there was a personal element, a sense of personal loss. She did not aspire to be First Lady, by a long shot. And frankly, they had not talked, even as a couple, as close as they were. That night, the night of August 1st, they had a discussion. They had actually had dinner at a reporter's house, Betty Beale.
Oh, yes.
Needless to say, before the evening was over, Betty Beale's husband said, "Mr. Vice President, you seem awfully quiet tonight." And Ford said, "Oh, well, I'm coming down with a cold." And then they went back home. That was the first time Ford was able to level with Betty about, we're never going to live in that vice presidential house. Here's what's going on. She made it very clear. I found an interview she did with Ford's ghostwriter for his memoir, which had never been available before now. And she said, Jerry came home and said, hey, basically offered him a deal. And I said, "You can't do that." He said, "I know." And that was the conversation they had. But I mean, she's a pivotal player in all of this. But as I say, until now, all of this has been, in effect, concealed.
Of course, we all know that he pardoned President Nixon, but did you learn anything new about the process of considering that and making that determination?
His great friend, first law partner, was a man named Phil Buchan. Very honorable guy who came from Grand Rapids. And Phil Buchan was to be the counsel. Ford came out of this press conference that I mentioned on the 28th of August, steaming. And he basically said, and Buchan recognized all the signs, he'd made up his mind. And he wanted Phil to kind of come up with a legal rationale, precedent, so forth, so on. The interesting thing, to me, fascinating, is Phil Buchan was a very moral guy. And Phil Buchan, although he would take orders from the president, was not convinced at that point that a pardon of Richard Nixon was morally justified. So what he did was, he summoned his pastor from Grand Rapids, who's this amazing, colorful, non-creedal Christian who had, no truck with God or miracles, and needless to say, stood out in a place like Grand Rapids. His name was Duncan Littlefair. His critics referred to him as Duncan Littlefaith. And he came to Washington secretly. And I found the Secret Service log-in information. So I know Duncan Littlefair was in the complex. I do not believe he ever talked to Ford. But the next best thing, he stayed with the Buchans at the Jefferson Hotel, which, by the way, was the same place where Leon Jaworski was living, which facilitated back and forths between, and that's how President Ford found out that it would be a year or two before there could even be a Nixon trial. But in any event, Duncan Littlefair came, he wrote out a statement heavy on mercy. And it turned out to be a maybe theologically admirable, but politically disastrous. Because Ford argued later on, it wasn't an act of mercy, but that's what it sounded like on Sunday morning when he announced it. It was a much more calculated, in the best sense of the word, political decision to do what needed to be done to get Richard Nixon off the national agenda so that we could refocus on what Ford thought was important. But that minister, and all of this is new. It's been secret, for 50 years. And there's more. The full story of the pardon has never been written. It probably, I won't say destroyed, it certainly affected permanently his relationship with Richard Nixon. Because Nixon said the day he accepted the pardon was the worst day of his life. Ford, I think, at times felt that Nixon was insufficiently appreciative of the pardon. Going through Phil Buchan's papers at the library one morning, a little scrap, handwritten, falls out. Leon Jaworski, the special prosecutor, called to make sure the president knew how impressed Jaworski was. And one of the reasons that Ford gave, and I found the diary notes of Phil Buchan's wife, who didn't agree with the pardon either. But this is Ford in the Oval Office to her husband, that he didn't want Leon Jaworski single-handedly to have the burden of whether to prosecute Nixon or not. Before Leon Jaworski died in 1983, he told at least two people, one of them was Mel Laird, that in fact, basically, he never intended to indict Richard Nixon. He did not want to indict Richard Nixon. He had a staff that wanted him to indict Richard Nixon, and there was some real tension there. But it's almost as if the pardon, which arguably prevented Ford from winning a full term in his own right, may not have been necessary, except, again, the rationale was, it almost doesn't matter. If it's going to be a year or two and the country is going to continue obsessed with Nixon, it doesn't matter what the special prosecutor does or doesn't. I have a responsibility to the presidency and to the country if I'm the one person who can change this dynamic.
Did Ford see the legacy of his presidency as being the pardon of Nixon and not being reelected in his own right?
Ford went to his grave believing that his legacy would be defined as basically the efforts he made, which he thought were reasonably successful, to try to restore public trust in the wake of Watergate. The biggest surprise in this book is, because we tend to think of, even admirers of Ford, think of him as a successful caretaker. I mean, he cleaned up messes. Not just, we haven't talked about Vietnam, but obviously the fall of Saigon. Remember the rogue elephant, the CIA, that needed periodically to be investigated? All of that, happened on Ford's watch. But with the perspective of time, now it becomes clear Ford was much more of an initiator than he was cleaning up messes. Economic deregulation that we all take for granted today, we may not like it, but we take it for granted, began under Ford. Ford created this task force, bipartisan, people from the Hill, they met regularly at the White House. He managed to get the railroads deregulated and the financial services industry, so the next time you use an ATM machine, tip your hat to Gerald Ford. But more important, the Carter administration and then the Reagan administration picked up on airline deregulation and other aspects of this. So today, again, we take it for granted, but it began with Gerald Ford. The Helsinki Accords in 1975, he was severely criticized from both the right and the left for, in effect, conceding the Soviet Empire. We now know that, in fact, Helsinki planted the seeds of resistance behind the Iron Curtain and was a major milestone on the road to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And finally, one thing for which he gets no credit at all, I have to admit I didn't know before I read the book. Africa, the biggest 180-degree turn in American foreign policy since Nixon going to China. On the eve of the Texas Republican primary, Ford sends Henry Kissinger to Africa to make everyone aware that henceforth the United States is no longer going to support white minority governments, beginning in Rhodesia, and, by the way, sending a signal to South Africa that the days of apartheid are numbered. A lot of people in the White House tried to talk him out of it, not because they opposed the policy, but because politically you couldn't have picked a worse time. Jim Baker was then a junior Commerce Department official. Later on, he was the chief delegate hunter for the campaign. Baker calls up Cheney, and of course he's from Texas. And Cheney says, look, we've tried. If you want to try, we'll make an appointment. They make an appointment. Ford's sitting there with his pipe. The man who said to lack guile acknowledged once he used the pipe as a prop. He found that he could basically set the tones of a conversation by how long he took to fill his pipe. It was all designed. And so anyway, he was sitting there listening. He was an excellent listener to Baker, go on and on, all the political reasons why. At least Kissinger doesn't have to have a big splashy press conference, to call attention to this. Ford said, well, Jim, I really appreciate everything you say. I really appreciate your coming over and, so on and so on. But, I think Henry's really doing a good job in Africa. I think the American people really should know about the job he's doing. And besides, pause, I'm sure that every thinking Texas voter will appreciate what we're doing. And Baker says, Mr. President, on this issue, there are no thinking Texas voters.
Given the uniqueness of his vice presidency, how important to him was the selection of Rockefeller as his vice president and then later ditching Rockefeller and going with Dole as a running mate?
Well, because he hated the job, he gave Rockefeller a lot of slack. They put together a list of 5 names. And someone points out to him, to put out that he's considering. And someone points out to him, there's no member of Congress there. And Ford immediately says, that's all right. Tell them we have a list of 6, and we won't identify the 6th, and they could all think it's them. But I don't think he ever seriously thought of anyone but Rockefeller. And it made sense on paper. It was a different time. It was a different party. Rockefeller represented what was left of the Eastern establishment. He had vast international experience. He had incredible contacts because Ford had to repopulate a government. We didn't know how many people were going to leave in the wake of Nixon's departure. By the way, mistake he made. I raised the question whether you can be too nice to be president. In retrospect, and people around him told him, Rumsfeld told him, other people said, you got to clean house. It doesn't matter that these people are innocent. It doesn't matter that they're competent. Symbolically, you've got to start over. And Ford wouldn't. He said, nobody leaves the plane without a parachute. And that was the attitude he took. Rockefeller, the classic Rockefeller story is, Rockefeller thought being vice president was going to be governor of New York times 20 or 30, and that he would actually be an initiator of policy. And thinking like Rockefeller, he came up with something called the Energy Independence Authority, which was $100 billion, bonded. It was a variation of the bonded agencies that were all teetering on bankruptcy, the verge of bankruptcy in New York. And Bill Simon, who rarely let a thought go unexpressed, particularly if it was negative, in a cabinet meeting in front of the vice president, said, don't let him do to America what he did to New York. And Ford afterwards said, Bill, lay off Nelson. I've got to throw him a bone. You and I both know this isn't a prayer on Capitol Hill. But basically because he didn't want to humiliate his vice president. How do you figure that? It's admirable on a human level? Is it smart politics? Probably not. He said later on he regretted sort of dumping Rockefeller. He said it was the one cowardly thing that I ever did.
And that was purely for politics.
It was purely for politics. He had been convinced, and I think the case is a strong one, that if Rockefeller had been on the ticket, it might have helped in November, but I'm not sure he would have been renominated.
Well, 2 quick questions before we go to the audience questions, and it's about the renomination process and the Reagan dynamic.
Yeah.
Anything new that you learned or fresh about the Ford-Reagan tensions?
Remember the great Lou Cannon said to me, Ford could never get it in his head that there were people who thought he wasn't conservative enough. He kept reading in the paper, this is the most conservative president since Coolidge. And again, as a product of Capitol Hill, with the parameters of liberal and conservative, he thought that, the pragmatists in the party would say, this is the most conservative candidate we can nominate and win. But the party was changing. It was changing literally all around him. And I don't think he fully appreciated that. I think they waited too long. They did something really dumb. Well, they did two things that were really dumb. They tried to buy Reagan off by offering him Secretary of Transportation. As if that weren't bad enough, Don Rumsfeld personally went and offered him the Commerce Department. And there was another relationship where they really disliked each other by the time of the convention. Ford was not one to hold a grudge, but he certainly felt that Reagan did not campaign for him in the fall the way that he campaigned for Reagan in 1980. I think there's something to that. I mean, they wanted Reagan to go to Texas and Mississippi and Southern California. When they carried California, they came close in Texas and Mississippi. Who knows? But the interesting thing is, by 1980, that was all in the past. It's interesting, at the Nixon funeral, well, remember all the presidents were, and he said afterwards, because this was before the Alzheimer's letter, and he said, there's something wrong with Ron. He said he really didn't seem to know who I was. And then after the Alzheimer's letter, it's interesting, people who were around said Ford never said anything harsh about Reagan after that. And they did get together on a couple of occasions. And after a while, Ford was able to kind of break through telling old stories. And I think also, their hearts went out to Mrs. Reagan. Interesting enough, it's almost the wives.
Well, that's my last question, Joe. I want to go back to Mrs. Ford.
Yeah.
And their relationship and her role as First Lady, the challenges personally that she faced and was transparent about. Talk about her significance.
Well, the first month he's president, he's gone. The pardon is issued on September 8th. Overnight, he drops 22 points in the Gallup poll. Still never matched. That's one bit of history no president wants to repeat. Well, within 3 weeks, Mrs. Ford is in the hospital. He said that night was the loneliest night of his life, not knowing, but fearing the worst.
Sure.
And of course, she had breast cancer surgery. Now, it's hard to believe, but in 1974, people didn't mention the word breast, let alone breast cancer. In obituaries, women died of a wasting disease. I mean, it was just phenomenal that ignorance was killing people. And she changed all that. I mean, literally overnight. And there's a wonderful picture in the book of her, 3 or 4 days after the surgery, and she's in the presidential suite. And the president's sitting next to her on the sofa, and they are both absolutely guffawing or something funny that one of them had said. And it's just, that was Mrs. Ford. The hardest thing to write in this book was an honest, fly-on-the-wall description of the intervention that occurred. Ford was, obviously, he knew then he was an enabler. Her father was an alcoholic, something she didn't know until the day of his funeral. She had an older brother who was an alcoholic. So there was a genetic component there. And alcohol was not a problem in the White House. There was an issue because of the medication she was taking, in effect, chemotherapy in a bottle. With alcohol, it could produce side effects. But basically, she was just so busy, and one of her staffers said she had a performance gene. Remember, she wanted to be a Martha Graham dancer. And all of that had sort of disappeared while she was having and raising a family while he was on the road. And then suddenly, she center stage. She was a marvelous hostess. She made it a much more informal place. She loved hanging out with old Hollywood stars. Cary Grant and her became very good friends. And that was, I think, the best part about being First Lady. Mrs. Ford's social secretary, Maria Downs, she told me the story. The only Hollywood type that Mrs. Ford said no. Maria said, "What about Jack Nicholson?" And Mrs. Ford said, "I don't think so, Maria." That was the only one that she turned down. But she had a wonderful time. And then they leave. Her kids are grown up. They're living in the desert. She's got a house that she's designing. And he's on the road again. And she thought this was going to be different. Well, it wasn't different. And that's when the drinking really became a problem. And finally, Susan was the one who said, "You've got to take this," to her father. You've got to take this seriously. And it turned out, in retrospect, she was probably closer to death than any of us knew at the time. It was that serious. But the intervention, which, the whole family came together, I think it was Easter weekend. And at first she thought, oh my gosh, what's this? The whole family is here. And then, of course, immediately she knew what was, because Susan had tried an intervention on her own just a few days before, and it had been disastrously unsuccessful. She basically kicked everyone out, including Susan and the doctor, threatened to pull his license if he ever came back. I mean, she was deep in denial, but they were all in denial. And it's an extraordinary story, what she went through, how incredibly humiliating those next few weeks must have been. But in the end, they saved her life. And
in the end, her legacy in that work has saved many thousands and thousands of lives.
Which is why, late in life, Ford would tell anyone that her historical contributions would outweigh his. And he was delighted. She got the Medal of Freedom 10 years before he did. He was delighted. People used to, when you went to, every year the Betty Ford Center would have an alumni reunion. And there were famous faces and there were obscure faces. And you could find Gerald Ford at the barbecue cooking hot dogs. That was his role. And he would always tell people, she's the president, I'm just a former president.
That's great. Audience questions.
Richard, thanks for coming today. The book is fantastic. I think it's one of your finest yet, which is saying something because you are the master of the craft. Two things for you. The first is, what's the best story or anecdote that you didn't include in the book that you wish you could have found a way to get in, or for whatever reason it's not in there, but it's just so damn fun? And the other question I have for you is, can you just tell the audience about the Ford honeymoon? Because to my reading, it sounds like a really fun weekend and a kind of model honeymoon for any young couple.
Okay, let me take the second first. He said later on, he thought he was giving her a great treat. They were married, they had a small wedding, she said, in a large reception. Then they drive to Ann Arbor and stay at the Allenell Hotel. And Mrs. Ford said, in the Allenell Hotel, it was such a fire trap. You never stayed above the second floor because you wanted to be able to have the option of jumping, in case of fire. And the second night of their wedded lives, again, she'd been warned. She had been warned by her future sister-in-law, you never have to worry about a woman. Jerry's mistress will be his work. So the second night of her honeymoon, they go to Owasso, Michigan for an outdoor rally featuring hometown favorite Thomas E. Dewey. And it's the middle of October in Michigan, so you can imagine what the weather was like. That was her honeymoon. They did go to Detroit overnight. The next day, they went to see a movie, but first he had to find a newspaper to find his name at the Dewey rally. She said later on our honeymoon, we did everything Jerry wanted to do. And he said he had been forced to give her multiple second honeymoons ever since. The first, I'm not being evasive. The fact is, all those stories are in the footnotes. The good stuff is in the footnotes.
Another question? Bob?
Congratulations on the book again. When you look at 1980 and the possibility of Reagan and Ford being on a ticket, as a historian, what's your assessment of the seriousness of that? And then after 1980, did Ford ever seriously consider running again?
That was a great question. It is absolutely absurd on the face of it, and it's equally absurd the more you get into it. The great mystery, and I don't have an answer for this, although I have a theory, is that Ford knew exactly what he was doing by stretching this out as long as he did, and they did all week. I think Reagan was perfectly sincere. The people around Reagan thought it was crazy. But, Ford gets on the private plane at the end of the week with his assistant, kicks back, puts his feet up and says, well, I had a pretty good convention. I gave a good speech, and I got George Bush as vice president. Now, I don't know for a fact, but I found out there's more to Gerald Ford than meets the eye. I think it's entirely possible. First of all, it was a kind of revenge. He spent all week having the Reagan people tell him he was indispensable, 4 years after they told America that he was very dispensable. So, I mean, I think there's a little bit of ego gratification there. There was a meeting at some point that week. Stu Spencer told me he was downstairs wondering what's going on upstairs and how serious is this? Exactly the question that you raise. Well, it was answered when he ran into Mrs. Ford, who said jokingly, but seriously, I'd divorce him. She had a new wife, they had a new wife. Life was good. She wasn't going back to Washington to be the vice president's wife. So I think a combination of factors, but I honestly believe it's entirely possible that Ford structured the whole thing so that at the end, the Reagan people had no choice but to go with George Bush. And it's interesting, the Bush-Ford relationship, I hadn't known until I dug. One of the first things that the first George Bush did, interestingly, was to install private phones in the both Ford residences, in Rancho Mirage and in Vail. So to afford President Bush the option of secure conversations with the former president. You know, they'd known each other. Bush had been a young congressman from Texas. Ford thought Bush represented the future of the party. His fantasy a year into the presidency was to bring Bush back from Beijing and make him vice president. And then make Rockefeller Secretary of Defense. Well, it didn't happen, but he thought a lot of George Bush, and it carried over. There was an awkward situation, as you might imagine. The whole Afghanistan and Iraq war. He certainly approved of the post 9/11 Afghanistan operation. He had his doubts about overthrowing Saddam. And what made it really awkward was because, of course, his people, Rumsfeld and Cheney, were architects of the policy. But it didn't interfere with the personal relationship. And the Bushes, W and Laura, were thoughtful enough. They made history. They had a birthday party at the White House for his 90th birthday, which was the first time that's ever happened. So, on the personal level, the relationship remained strong. But policy-wise, he had his disagreements.
Another question right here.
I want to talk about women and equal rights. I know in 1970, when Martha Griffiths, his Democratic colleague from Michigan, was trying to get enough signatures to get a discharge petition, rare at that time, after she got to 201, Ford kicked in and pulled a lot of Republicans so she had enough to release it. And when it passed, finally in 1972, he says, I'm just going to be delighted to tell Betty now that she's an equal citizen. But we think of Mrs. Ford as the advocate of the Equal Rights Amendment. And clearly by 1980, it doesn't surprise me that she said she'd divorce him since Reagan had wiped the ERA out of the Republican platform. So describe sort of the domestic and political relationship around women's rights in an era in which it sort of began with a bang with the passage of the ERA, and then by the 80s, you've got Phyllis Schlafly as the princess of the prom.
And he did this on his own, although I'm sure Mrs. Ford urged him on. He said he wouldn't attend the 1975 Gridiron Dinner unless it was open to women. Hard to believe that late it was, in fact, not. And that sort of broke down the barriers. Remember, one of the things that actually brought him and Jimmy Carter together was they were both accustomed to strong women, mothers who were remarkably forceful in shaping their characters and their outlook, wives, likewise. I mean, he was very comfortable around strong women. He took women seriously, but Mrs. Ford's sister-in-law was absolutely right. His mistress was work.
Richard, I have one final question for you. Given all that you knew and now know more, given writing this book, if you were to have the opportunity to sit down and have dinner this evening with President Ford, what would you ask him?
Great question. There are so many things that I kept thinking, because I asked him a lot. I once spent 3 hours in a hotel room in Grand Rapids wargaming the pardon. And it changed my attitude. But you're right, there are so many things. I guess, you know what? You'll laugh. I'd ask him, what do you know about your bigamist grandfather? Killed in a train wreck
I didn't see that.
in very suspicious circumstances. I found one interview where he once made passing reference to, in a kind of, I don't know much about this sort of way, which leads me to believe that he knew everything about it. But I mean, it's an odd question, but it's one of those key, if you can turn that key, then you'd have a real glimpse into the man's character.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today, and I'd like to thank the audience of our
Absolutely.
White
Thank
House
you.
1600 sessions. And for our White House 1600 session audience, the book is An Ordinary Man, The Surprising Life and Historic Presidency of Gerald R. Ford by Richard Norton Smith. Now, Richard, I want to thank you on behalf of the association because you very thoughtfully released this the same year that we honored Gerald Ford with our White House Christmas ornament. So that was very strategic thinking on your part. But this year we are honoring President Ford with our 2023 White House Christmas ornament, which is the first wreath we've done, but it's decorated with items that the Fords used during their 3 Christmases in the White House. And on the reverse, there are iconic elements that highlight different parts of President Ford's life, leadership, and legacy. It's an honor to be with you today and to share this book with you. It's an extraordinary work, and I congratulate you on this and thank you for your scholarship that you've contributed to the study of the presidency.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for listening and watching today. I've had the great privilege to bring you stories like the one here today since the program began in 2017. You can listen to the dozens of interviews I've done over the years on your favorite podcast provider, or you can watch them on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. All of us here at the White House Historical Association, thank you for your support. When you become an association member, or when you purchase a book or an official White House Christmas ornament, you are helping to fund our education mission through teacher programming, publishing, and even this podcast. You can learn more about our work as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization by going to our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.